Hey developers, today we're going to look at Sapper, which as the tagline suggests, it's the next small thing in web development. Essentially, it's a way to create Svelte apps server-side rendered. So you can think of this as the next or nuxt version for Svelte. So next is the server-side rendered in React, and nuxt is server-side rendered framework for Vue, and this is the server-side rendered framework for Svelte. So it has some unique advantages. I want to go ahead and show you just an overview of it and how to get started. So make sure you watch all the way to the end and you can learn all about it. And as always, my name is Eric. I'm a full-stack software developer. I'm a big Vue.js fan. I'm a big frameworks fan. And I thought I would just go ahead and jump into Sapper. So if you haven't watched the first video, I did a video on Svelte last week. I'll make sure it's in the description below. You can check that out. I just kind of went over the basics of getting started with Svelte. So obviously in this video, we're going to look at the basics getting started with Sapper. So as it says, it builds fast, best of both worlds. It's powered by Svelte. So you get that single page application, but you also get that really fast rendering of the app. As soon as it starts, it's server-side rendered. And then basically you get that single page application feel because then basically it's running in your browser at that point after it's rendered from the server after it initially appears on your Chrome or Firefox or Safari browser. To get started, it's going to be similar to the way Svelte gets started. You'd use this npx-degit, which is a way to kind of download our template. So let's see if we can do that. And while we're doing that, we're going to kind of go back and forth and also look at the documentation. So I'm going to just hit npx-degit here, and it should start downloading and putting it in this folder. I'm using Visual Studio Code. And I have a few extensions. I'm just using the same extensions I had before I showed you in the last video. I'm using the Svelte extension. I installed the Svelte IntelliSense and then the Svelte 3 snippets. I didn't install anything else. I don't think there's a Sapper Svelte extension that I know of. I think these will get you everything you need to start off with. Cool. So I went ahead and cloned it here. And I'm just going to change directory to my app. And I'll do an npm I for an npm install. Of course, if you're a Yarn fan, you can use Yarn as well. And that'll install all the dependencies. While it's doing that, let's take a look at the website. So you can see here npm install, and then I can do npm run dev, and then I can open on the website. So this kind of, I mentioned this in my last video, but this is like the ideal web app framework, and they wanted to accomplish these goals, and this was like the one blog post that explained what goals they were trying to accomplish. So it needs to do server-side rendering. It should be universal, so write once for server and client. So it hydrates the server-rendered HTML. It also has some progressive web app stuff in here too, and I'll show you once we get the app ready and up and running. It has to have offline support and progressive web app, like I just said. It needs to be first-rate developer experience with hot module reloading. It needs to should be possible to understand any customize every aspect of the system, and it should be really easy to learn. And I think for the most part, from playing around with it and just learning myself the last couple of days, I definitely think Sapper hits all those things. The docs are pretty good. Like the docs for Svelte, they're pretty good. You can see here where to begin, what is Sapper, tells you about the different routes, and it kind of tells you how to get started. So let's go back over here. All right, so it looks like it installed. And I'm going to run npm run dev. And that will run it. We can do a quick tour of the Visual Studio Code and what it created. But let's see. It's listening on port 3000. So let's just open that up. 3000. Cool. Great success. There's Borat there. High five. And you see it gives you basic navigation. And it has some blog posts here, which we'll look at in a second and see how it did that. So let's take a tour of what it includes when you start. So it gives you, as a scene default for this template, it gives you Cypress. If you don't know what Cypress is, that's an end-to-end test runner. I personally enjoy it a lot. I use it in my own work, and it's based on, it's like a Chrome Cypress end-to-end test runner, which is great. Let's look at the package.json, get an idea. So you can see here it has nodes. And one thing is we're running a node server, and that's how many of these server-side rendered frameworks work. So you can do, usually it gives you two options, and Sapper is no different. You can either export it into these, basically export it into static files, or you can actually run the whole app in a node instance, basically as a node app, and then as the app runs and you connect to the site, it server-side renders it, hydrates it on the client side, and then essentially becomes a single-page application. So this is no different. You can see here it gives you the Cypress run and open commands, a dev, and then, oops, I accidentally hit build. So it's building right now. I'm going to just stop that. And it has the build and export. So export, so I'll show you guys just right off the bat. So if we go npm run export, what this is doing is it's basically generating the single page. It's basically creating a static site for you. So if we go look back in here, there's the Sapper and has build, and then has export. So here's what it just created. It created all the routes as and they're in these pages here. So that way, when you run this onto the server, it's essentially it just loads all these files. They're statically generated, so it just pops up as soon as you run them. Of course, this wouldn't be perfect for all situations. You may want to, if you're doing a lot of dynamic stuff in your web app, you probably don't want to use this export function. If you're doing different sessions, things like that. But as for a quick site, to a very quick statically generated site, that now you can actually copy this whole folder to a static site generator like GitHub Pages if you wanted. It would work fine. And so this is essentially what it did. It created it this way. Now, if I run npm run build, what this is going to do is it's going to build it as a Node.js app. So if we go back to the build, now we have this index.js file, which creates a server. And don't worry about the ESLint errors. And you have service worker, that's for if we're using a progressive web app. So now we can, has client and server directories here. But essentially now we're running it as a server. And a node server, and this would be how you do it, like universal mode is what it's called in other frameworks, where it's essentially you're running it on the server as a server-side rendered app. So that's that. Let's run it normally again. And let's look at the directories. So we talked a little bit about the Sapper directory. This is where the build is, development and export builds. But if we go in the source folder, this is how the layout is. So the server.js, this is the node server that it runs when it gets when you start it, when you start the app. The client.js, this is something that Node puts in there that tells it kind of the entry point of the app itself. Service workers is the way it's doing caching, offline caching. But essentially this is for if you're using progressive web apps. I'm not going to get into that. And template.html, this is like your index.html file for Sapper. And you have these things here. You see the Sapper base. These are like little initializations, and it tells where to put different information when you're running the different Svelte files. In fact, if you go to the documentation, it does mention a little bit about that in here. Oh, by the way, you can do npm start, npm test, npm run dev. You saw that all in the package.json files. And here, so there's the source template HTML. This tells you this file is a template for responses from the server. Sapper will inject content that replaces the following tags. So you have the base, style, head, HTML, and script. Okay, so now each route here is actually essentially this routes folder is how you create your routes. So I keep referencing back to Vue, but I'm certain people probably have used Nuxt. You know how you create files in your routes folder in Nuxt. It goes ahead and creates the route. This is the same similar way. This layout is this is what surrounds every single one of your Svelte components. This is a reserved file that Sapper uses that kind of makes everything possible. So like, for example, the navigation component is here, and this segment is actually the segment that comes after the slash. It's like the parameters or the route that you're on. And so that's where you can export, and this is a reserved segment, is something reserved for Sapper, and I'll show you a little bit more about that. And then the error, this is for the error route. So let's start, the server's running, and we have the script here, and it says title status, but if you put in, I don't know, h3 error, oops, actually that's why, because I see what I did right here. So I put this in Svelte head, and what this is this head right here sets the title of the page itself. This is where you may want to put in anything you put in the head tag. So we're not going to worry about that. But if we put it down here and reset it, there it goes. Here's the error that we just put in there. So that's working. So you can, obviously this is your error page. You can change it to whatever you want. Here is the about page and the index page. And Sapper project, great success. There's the Borat. So if I wanted to create a new route, I just need to do new file. We'll call it Erik.svelte. And just to get things going, I'm going to just copy and paste this whole page here. We'll just do that. And we'll go back to the Erik, and I'll paste it. So now this head is kind of by convention, you put this head on each one of them so you can put the different titles that you want. So I'll put Erik. I'll put Erik route. I'll save it. And now I get the home and about. And if I put /Erik, cool, here's the Erik route. So I went ahead and created it. And all I needed to do is just add it inside this routes folder itself. And that's as simple as that. Now I can go into the nav component. So here's the components folder. This is like anything you're going to be adding inside any of these different routes. Here's the segment. You can see here it has different LIs. So I could create another one. And right here, this is the way you do routing. So you can just put in Erik, segment equals Erik, and href equals Erik. Erik here. Once again, I might have to restart the server, but let's see. Okay, cool. So now it's on Erik, and it's working correctly. So you just use anchor tags like this, and it should work, and that's how you add new routes. All right, so we kind of got the basics there. Let's take a look at this blog and see a little bit of what it's doing. So this posts here is a file that has a bunch of post information. Here it is, the index.svelte. So I wanted to show you guys this. I'm not going to get into too many specifics of how this blog part works right here. Certainly download this yourself and take a look. But what I want to show you is that there's this preload here at the top. It's using something called this.fetch. And what this does is essentially preload is running before the app loads itself. So this is actually running on the server. And since we're running on the server, we actually don't have access to fetch. But this.fetch is something that Sapper added that we do have access to. And if, let's say, we put in a console log preloading here, and we save it, and then we come back here, refresh it, you see, we do see down here in the terminal that it's running. So that preloading means it's running on the server side. But if we look in the inspect, it's not running on the client side. So that's just the way it works, I believe. Yeah, so what happens is the first time it runs on the server side, and then this preload actually runs on the client side as well. So after the app is fully loaded, it runs it on the client side. So in the initial time, it only runs it once on the server side, and then after every time you go back to this route, then it'll run it on the client side. And that's why you see preloading down here, but you don't see, well, let me clear this out. So we don't have preloading twice. If I refresh it here, there's no preloading here. There's preloading. Let me restart it. Okay, so if we go back down here, and I'll clear it. Let's go to the blog route. That's the one we want to be on. You see it's preloading, but it didn't preload on the server because the app is already loaded, essentially. But if I go back to the client and I do a refresh, you don't see it seeing preloading here, but you see preloading here because it ran on the server. A little confusing at first, but that's essentially how it works. It's Sapper smart enough not to run it twice, but it will run it on the server first. If you wanted to specifically run something on the client, you can use like your on mount hook, and this will always run on the client. So test. To actually get this working, we have to do one more thing, and that is to import on mount from Svelte. Otherwise, it won't know what that is. So if we import it in, cool, it works, and we see test as we expect it. All right, so that's essentially everything I wanted to show you guys today. I think you can create some pretty amazing apps with Sapper and using Svelte. It's really simple to get started. I want to hear what you guys think. Leave a comment below. Let me know what you think of Sapper. Thanks.